Chapter 5 of The Turmoil. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Turmoil, Volume 1 of The Growth Trilogy, by Booth Tarkington. Chapter 5. Mr. Vertrees, having watched their departure with the air of a man who had something at hazard upon the expedition, turned from the window and began to pace the library thoughtfully, pending their return. He was about 60, a small man, withered and dry and fine, a trim little sketch of an elderly dandy. His lambrequin moustache, relic of a forgotten Anglomania, had been profoundly black, but now, like his smooth hair, it was approaching an equally sheer whiteness, and though his clothes were old, they had a shapeliness and a flavour of mode. And for greater spruceness there were some jaunty touches, grey spats, a narrow black ribbon across the grey waistcoat to the eyeglasses in a pocket, a fleck of colour from a button in the lapel of the black coat, labelling him the descendant of patriot warriors. The room was not like him, being cheerful and hideous, whereas Mr. Vertrees was anxious and decorative. Under a mantle of imitation black marble a merry little coal-fire beamed forth upon high and narrow Eastlake bookcases with long glass doors, and upon comfortable, incongruous furniture, and upon meaningless woodwork everywhere, and upon half a dozen Landseer engravings which Mr. and Mrs. Vertrees sometimes mentioned to each other, after 30 years of possession, as "very fine things." They had been the first people in town to possess Landseer engravings, and there in art they had rested, but they still had a feeling that in all such matters they were in the van, and when Mr. Vertrees discovered Landseers upon the walls of other people's houses he thawed, as a chieftain to a trusted follower, and if he found an edition of Bulwer Lytton accompanying the Landseers as a final corroboration of culture, he would say, inevitably, "Those people know good pictures, and they know good books." The growth of the city, which might easily have made him a millionaire, had ruined him because he had failed to understand it. When towns begin to grow they have whims, and the whims of a town always ruin somebody. Mr. Vertrees had been most strikingly the somebody in this case. At about the time he bought the Landseers, he owned, through inheritance, an office building and a large house not far from it, where he spent the winter, and he had a country place, a farm of 400 acres, where he went for the summers to the comfortable, ugly old house that was his home now, perforce, all the year round. If he had known how to sit still and let things happen, he would have prospered miraculously, but strangely enough the dainty little man was one of the first to fall down and worship bigness, the which proceeded straightway to enact the role of Juggernaut for his better education. He was a true prophet for the prodigious growth, but he had a fatal gift for selling good and buying bad. He should have stayed at home and looked at his Landseers and read his Bulwer, but he took his cow to market, and the trained milkers milked her dry and then ate her. He sold the office building and the house in town to buy a great tract of lots in a new suburb, then he sold the farm, except the house and the ground about it, to pay the taxes on the suburban lots, and to keep them up. The lots refused to stay up, but he had to do something to keep himself and his family up, so in despair he sold the lots, which went up beautifully the next year, for traction stock that was paying dividends, and thereafter he ceased to buy and sell. Thus he disappeared altogether from the commercial surface at about the time James Sheridan came out securely on top, and Sheridan, until Mrs. Vertrees called upon him with her anti-smoke committee, had never heard the name. Mr. Vertrees, pinched, retired to his Landseers, and Mrs. Vertrees managed somehow on the dividends, though managing became more and more difficult as the years went by, and money bought less and less. But there came a day when 3 servitors of bigness in Philadelphia took greedy counsel with 4 fellow worshippers from New York, and not long after that there were no more dividends for Mr. Vertrees. In fact, there was nothing for Mr. Vertrees, because the traction stock henceforth was no stock at all, and he had mortgaged his house long ago to help manage somehow, according to his conception of his position in life, one of his own old-fashioned phrases. 6 months before the completion of the new house next door, Mr. Vertrees had sold his horses and the worn Victoria and station wagon to pay the arrears of his 2 servants and re-establish credit at the grocer's and butcher's, and a pair of elderly carriage horses with such accoutrements are not very ample barter in these days for 6 months' food and fuel and service. Mr. Vertrees had discovered, too, that there was no salary for him in all the buzzing city. He could do nothing. It may be said that he was at the end of his string. Such times do come in all their bitterness, finally, to the man with no trade or craft, if his feeble clutch on that slippery ghost, property, shall fail. The windows grew black while he paced the room, and smoky twilight closed round about the house, yet not more darkly than what closed round about the heart of the anxious little man patrolling the fan-shaped zone of firelight. But as the mantel clock struck wheezily 6, there was the rattle of an outer door, and a rich and beautiful peal of laughter went ringing through the house. Thus cheerfully did Mary Vertrees herald her return with her mother from their expedition among the barbarians. She came rushing into the library and threw herself into a deep chair by the hearth, laughing so uncontrollably that tears were in her eyes. Mrs. Vertrees followed decorously, no mirth about her. On the contrary, she looked vaguely disturbed, as if she had eaten something not quite certain to agree with her, and regretted it. "Papa! Oh, oh!" and Miss Vertrees was fain to apply a handkerchief upon her eyes. "I'm so glad you made us go. I wouldn't have missed it." Mrs. Vertrees shook her head. "I suppose I'm very dull," she said gently. "I didn't see anything amusing. They're most ordinary, and the house is altogether in bad taste, but we anticipated that, and—" "Papa!" Mary cried, breaking in, "they asked us to dinner!" "What?" "And I'm going!" she shouted, and was seized with fresh paroxysms. "Think of it! Never in their house before, never met any of them but the daughter, and just barely met her—" "What about you?" interrupted Mr. Vertrees, turning sharply upon his wife. She made a little face, as if positive now that what she had eaten would not agree with her. "I couldn't," she said. "I—" "Yes, that's just the way she looked when they asked her," cried Mary, choking. "And then she realized it, and tried to turn it into a cough, and she didn't know how, and it sounded like a squeal." "I suppose," said Mrs. Vertrees, much injured, "that Mary will have an uproarious time at my funeral. She makes fun of—" Mary jumped up instantly and kissed her. Then she went to the mantel, and, leaning an elbow upon it, gazed thoughtfully at the buckle of her shoe, twinkling in the firelight. "They didn't notice anything," she said. "So far as they were concerned, mamma, it was one of the finest coughs you ever coughed." "Who were they?" asked her father. "Whom did you see?" "Only the mother and daughter," Mary answered. "Mrs. Sheridan is dumpy and rustly, and Miss Sheridan is pretty and pushing. Dresses by the fashion magazines, and talks about New York people that have their pictures in 'em. She tutors the mother, but not very successfully, partly because her own foundation is too flimsy, and partly because she began too late. They've got an enormous Moor of painted plaster or something in the hall, and the girl evidently thought it was to her credit that she selected it." "They have oil paintings, too," added Mrs. Vertrees, with a glance of gentle pride at the Landseers. "I've always thought oil paintings in a private house the worst of taste." "Oh, if one owned a Raphael or a Titian," said Mr. Vertrees, finishing the implication, not in words, but with a wave of his hand. "Go on, Mary. None of the rest of them came in? You didn't meet Mr. Sheridan or—" He paused, and adjusted a lump of coal in the fire delicately with the poker. "Or one of the sons?" Mary's glance crossed his, at that, with a flash of utter comprehension. He turned instantly away, but she had begun to laugh again. "No," she said, "no one except the women, but mamma inquired about the sons thoroughly." "Mary!" Mrs. Vertrees protested. "Oh, most adroitly, too," laughed the girl, "only she couldn't help unconsciously turning to look at me when she did it." "Mary Vertrees!" "Never mind, mamma. Mrs. Sheridan and Miss Sheridan, neither of them could help unconsciously turning to look at me, speculatively, at the same time. They all three kept looking at me and talking about the oldest son, Mr. James Sheridan, Jr. Mrs. Sheridan said his father is very anxious to get Jim to marry and settle down, and she assured me that Jim is right cultivated. Another of the sons, the youngest one, caught me looking in the window this afternoon, but they didn't seem to consider him quite one of themselves, somehow, though Mrs. Sheridan mentioned that a couple of years or so ago he had been right sick, and had been to some cure or other. They seemed relieved to bring the subject back to Jim and his virtues, and to look at me. The other brother is the middle one, Roscoe. He's the one that owns the new house across the street, where that young black sheep of the Lamhorns, Robert, goes so often. I saw a short, dark young man standing on the porch with Robert Lamhorn there the other day, so I suppose that was Roscoe. Jim still lurks in the mists, but I shall meet him to-night, papa." She stepped nearer to him so that he had to face her, and his eyes were troubled as he did. There may have been a trouble deep within her own, but she kept their surface merry with laughter. "Papa, Bibbs is the youngest one's name, and Bibbs, to the best of our information, is a lunatic. Roscoe is married. Papa, does it have to be Jim?" "Mary!" Mrs. Vertrees cried sharply, "you're outrageous. That's a perfectly horrible way of talking." "Well, I'm close to 24," said Mary, turning to her. "I haven't been able to like anybody yet that's asked me to marry him, and maybe I never shall. Until a year or so ago I've had everything I ever wanted in my life. You and papa gave it all to me, and it's about time I began to pay back. Unfortunately, I don't know how to do anything, but something's got to be done." "But you needn't talk of it like that," insisted the mother plaintively. It's not... "No, it's not," said Mary. "I know that." "How did they happen to ask you to dinner?" Mr. Vertrees inquired uneasily. "It's an extraordinary thing." "Climbers' hospitality," Mary defined it. "We were so very cordial and easy. I think Mrs. Sheridan herself might have done it just as any kind old woman on a farm might ask a neighbor, but it was Miss Sheridan who did it. She played around it a while. You could see she wanted to. She's in a dreadful hurry to get into things, and I fancied she had an idea it might impress that Lamhorn boy to find us there tonight. It's a sort of house-warming dinner, and they talked about it, and then the girl got her courage up and blurted out the invitation, and mamma—" Here Mary was once more a victim to incorrigible merriment. "Mamma tried to say yes, and couldn't. She swallowed and squealed. I mean, you coughed, dear. And then, papa, she said that you and she had promised to go to a lecture at the Emerson Club tonight, but that her daughter would be delighted to come to the big show. So there I am, and there's Mr. Jim Sheridan, and there's the clock. Dinner's at 7:30. And she ran out of the room, scooping up her fallen furs with a gesture of flying grace as she sped. When she came down, at 20 minutes after 7, her father stood in the hall, at the foot of the stairs, waiting to be her escort through the dark. He looked up and watched her as she descended, and his gaze was fond and proud, and profoundly disturbed. But she smiled and nodded gaily, and when she reached the floor, put a hand on his shoulder. "At least no one could suspect me tonight," she said. "I look rich, don't I, papa?" She did. She had a look that worshipful girl friends bravely called regal. A head taller than her father, she was as straight and jauntily poised as a boy athlete, and her brown hair and her brown eyes were like her mother's, but for the rest she went back to some stronger and livelier ancestor than either of her parents. "Don't I look too rich to be suspected?" she insisted. "You look everything beautiful, Mary," he said huskily. "And my dress?" She threw open her dark velvet cloak, showing a splendor of white and silver. "Anything better at Nice next winter, do you think?" She laughed, shrouding her glittering figure in the cloak again. "2 years old, and no one would dream it. I did it over." "You can do anything, Mary." There was a curious humility in his tone, and something more, a significance not veiled and yet abysmally apologetic. It was as if he suggested something to her and begged her forgiveness in the same breath. And upon that, for the moment, she became as serious as he. She lifted her hand from his shoulder, and then set it back more firmly, so that he should feel the reassurance of its pressure. "Don't worry," she said in a low voice and gravely. "I know exactly what you want me to do." End of Chapter 5. Read by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org, on Friday, April 24th, 2009, in San Diego, California.